My husband worked late every Friday. But one day he left his phone and a woman called. "I'm waiting for you, darling." The address turned out to be my best friend's house. What I did next. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Looking back now, I can see exactly where the cracks began. But at the time, I was too busy living inside the illusion to notice the walls were already crumbling. My name is Laura. I was 34 years old, living in a 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb of Chicago, married to Daniel, my husband of 7 years. We'd met in college, fallen in love over bad coffee and late-night study sessions, and built what I genuinely believed was a solid, ordinary, beautiful life. Daniel was a project manager at a mid-sized logistics firm downtown. I worked part-time as a medical billing specialist, which gave me flexibility to manage the house, run errands, and be present in a way I was proud of. We didn't have children yet. That was still a conversation we were having carefully, the way you handle something fragile. We had a dog named Biscuit, a mortgage we were slowly winning against, and a standing Saturday morning tradition of pancakes and the crossword puzzle. That was my life. That was the life I loved. And then there were Fridays. It started so quietly that I almost didn't notice. Around 14 months before everything fell apart, Daniel began staying late at work on Fridays. At first, it was occasional, once or twice a month. He'd text around 5:30, "Running behind, big deadline, don't wait up." I never questioned it. Project managers have deadlines. That's just reality. I'd eat dinner alone, watch something on TV, and he'd come home around 9 or 10 smelling of takeout and tiredness. Perfectly ordinary. But then it became every Friday, without exception. I told myself it was a busy season. Then I told myself it was a new client. Then I stopped telling myself anything and just accepted it as the new rhythm of our week. That's what you do when you trust someone completely. You fill in the gaps with generous explanations. You give them the benefit of every doubt because you believe they've earned it. Except small things started to accumulate, the way dust does, invisible, until suddenly you can write your name in it. Daniel started keeping his phone face down on the kitchen counter. Not dramatically, not obviously, just always face down. He used to leave it anywhere carelessly, the way people do when they have nothing to hide. Then one evening I walked past it and it buzzed, and he crossed the room faster than I'd ever seen him move to pick it up. He smiled at me afterward, that practiced, easy smile, and said it was a work notification. I nodded. I said nothing, but something cold and quiet moved through me. He began showering the moment he came home on Friday nights. Always. He'd walk in, greet me briefly, and go straight to the bathroom. Before, he'd sit on the couch and decompress for 20 minutes, still in his work clothes, talking about his week. Now he scrubbed himself clean before we even spoke properly. I noticed he'd started caring about how he dressed on Fridays specifically. A better shirt. A spritz of the cologne he used to wear only for date nights. And Rachel, my best friend Rachel, who I'd known for 11 years, had become oddly distant. We used to have lunch at least twice a month. We texted constantly. But over those same 14 months, she'd grown harder to reach, always busy, always rescheduling. When we did meet, she seemed distracted, slightly guilty, like someone sitting on a secret that was too heavy for her posture. I noticed all of this, and I buried it. Because what was the alternative? To look directly at something you're not ready to see? Then came the Friday that changed everything. It was an ordinary evening in March. Cold outside, a thin gray sky pressing down on the city. Daniel had left for work that morning like always. Around 6 o'clock, his phone buzzed on the counter. He'd forgotten it. I stared at it for a long moment. I wasn't going to look through it. I want to be clear about that. I believed even then in his privacy, in us. But then it rang, an actual call. And because I was standing right there, I saw the screen before I could look away. No name, just a number. And I answered it. Not even thinking, just reflexively, the way you answer a ringing phone. The voice on the other end was warm and feminine and utterly unsuspecting. "Hey, baby, I'm already here. How much longer? I've got the wine open. I'm waiting for you, sweetheart." The world didn't spin. It didn't shatter dramatically. It simply stopped. Like a clock someone had reached into and stilled with their fingers. I said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then I asked very quietly, "Who is this?" A sharp intake of breath. Silence. Then the call ended. I stood in my kitchen holding my husband's phone. The wine was already open somewhere. Someone was already waiting. And I had a horrible cellular certainty about who that someone was, because I recognized the faint sound of traffic in the background, the distinctive pattern of it, the stop-and-go rhythm of the intersection I knew by heart. The intersection 2 blocks from Rachel's apartment. I didn't cry that night. That surprised me more than anything. I'd always imagined, the way you imagine things you hope will never happen, that if I ever discovered a betrayal like this, I would collapse, fall apart at the seams, weep until I had nothing left. But I stood in that kitchen for a long time after the call ended, and what I felt was not grief. Not yet. It was something colder and more structural, like the feeling of a building settling after an earthquake. The damage is done, the shaking is stopped, and now you're doing a silent inventory of what's still standing. I put Daniel's phone back exactly where he'd left it, face down, precisely as he'd positioned it. Then I sat at the kitchen table and I thought, the voice on the phone had been Rachel's. I was almost certain. Not because I had proof, not yet, but because I knew that voice the way you know the sound of your own name. 11 years of friendship, 11 years of phone calls and late-night conversations and ugly crying on each other's sofas. I knew how she sounded when she was relaxed and warm and expecting someone she wanted. And that voice, low, easy, intimate, had been hers. And the traffic. I couldn't shake the traffic. Rachel lived on Maple Grove, just off Weston Avenue. That intersection had a particular rhythm. A long red light, a cluster of cars, then silence. I'd sat in it dozens of times waiting to turn into her street. 2 + 2. But knowing and proving are entirely different countries. Daniel came home at 10:15 that night. He walked in, saw his phone on the counter, and I watched his face, just for a fraction of a second, tighten with relief. He thought I hadn't noticed. He picked it up, slid it into his pocket, and said, "Long day. You eat already?" "Yes," I said. "Good." He kissed my forehead. "I'm exhausted. I'm going to shower." Of course he was. I lay awake that night beside him, and I did the math. Not the emotional math. Not yet. I wasn't ready for that. But the practical math. The math of what my life actually looked like on paper. We had a joint bank account with roughly $42,000 in it. We had the house, which we'd bought 6 years ago for $380. It was now worth somewhere around $460 based on the neighborhood comps I'd seen. We had Daniel's 401k, which I knew was substantial. He'd mentioned once, proudly, that it had crossed $110,000. We had 1 car each, and we had 7 years of a life woven so tightly together that separating it would be like trying to unpick a knot in the dark. And then there was the question that sat on my chest like a stone all night. How long? How long had this been happening? Had it been months? Over a year? Had Rachel sat across from me at lunch, listened to me talk about my marriage, my hopes, my anxieties, and said nothing? Had she hugged me at Christmas knowing what she was doing on Friday nights? The anger, when it finally arrived, didn't come as an explosion. It came as clarity. By the time gray morning light pushed through the curtains, I had made a decision. I was not going to confront Daniel with a phone call I couldn't prove I'd answered. I was not going to scream at Rachel before I had facts. I was not going to do anything that would tip them off, give them time to align their stories, or allow them to gaslight me into doubting what I already knew in my bones. I was going to find out the truth, all of it, before I made a single move. The first thing I did that Monday morning after Daniel left for work was call my doctor and ask for a referral. Not because I was falling apart, though part of me was, but because I'd learned years ago in a psychology elective that the smartest thing a person can do in a crisis is talk to someone trained to help them think straight. I needed a therapist, not for healing, not yet, for strategy and stability. The second thing I did was call a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Holt. A friend of a colleague had used her in a divorce 2 years prior and described her as someone who doesn't let anyone walk away with what isn't theirs. I liked that. I called her office, gave my name, and made an appointment for Thursday. The third thing I did was open a personal savings account at a bank where Daniel and I had no shared history. I transferred $2,000 from my own freelance earnings, money I'd accumulated slowly from occasional extra billing work, money that was legally mine and mine alone, into it. A starting point, a small, quiet foothold. I didn't have a full plan yet, but I had a direction, and for now, that was enough. Patricia Holt's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, and the view from her window showed the whole city spread out below, orderly and indifferent, the way cities are. She was a small woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses she took on and off with an efficiency that suggested she had no patience for wasted time. I liked her immediately. I told her everything, the phone call, the Fridays, the behavior changes, the geography of that traffic sound. She listened without interrupting, making occasional notes on a yellow legal pad, and when I finished, she took her glasses off and looked at me steadily. "You haven't confronted him," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No." "Good." She put her glasses back on. "Here's what you need to understand, Laura. In Illinois, infidelity doesn't directly affect property division. We're an equitable distribution state, not a fault state for assets. But it can influence certain arguments, and more importantly, what you do right now affects your negotiating position significantly. If you confront him before we have documentation, you lose the element of preparation. He lawyers up, assets potentially move, stories get coordinated. Do you understand? I understood completely. She walked me through what I needed. Financial documentation, statements, tax returns, account records, a clear picture of all marital assets. She advised me not to move any substantial joint funds yet, as it could be characterized as dissipation. She told me about a private investigator she worked with regularly, a man named Gary Stills, who was discreet and thorough. I hired Gary that same afternoon. He charged a flat rate for a 2-week surveillance package. I paid him from my personal account. The new one Daniel knew nothing about. That night, I made dinner as usual. I asked Daniel about his week. I listened to him talk about a logistics software rollout at work, and I laughed at a story he told about his office manager. And I poured him more wine, and the entire time I was watching him the way you watch a documentary, with interest, with distance, with the understanding that you are observing something you are no longer inside of. He suspected nothing. Why would he? I was the same Laura I'd always been, warm, engaged, present. Rachel texted me mid-week. "Hey stranger, miss your face. Coffee soon?" I replied after 20 minutes. "Definitely, things have just been crazy. I'll reach out next week." Warm, normal, nothing to see here. And then the following Friday, Gary sent me a message at 9:47 p.m. Package ready for review. Meet Monday? I met him Monday morning at a coffee shop near his office. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were photographs, printed, time-stamped, clear. Daniel's car parked on Maple Grove Street, not once, 3 consecutive Fridays, including the one 2 weeks prior. Daniel entering the front door of a building I knew with sick recognition, Rachel's building. And one photograph, the one that stole all the air from my lungs, taken through a street-level window. Not invasive, not intimate, just damning. Daniel and Rachel at her kitchen table, wine glasses between them, her hand covering his, both of them laughing. I looked at those photographs for a long time. 11 years of friendship, 7 years of marriage, and this kitchen table, this wine, these hands. Gary had also noted that based on his records, this pattern appeared to have been ongoing for at least 8 months, possibly longer. He'd cross-referenced vehicle logs and noted Daniel's car had appeared on that street as far back as records allowed him to confirm. Roughly 14 months ago. 14 months. The same timeline as the Fridays. I put the photographs back in the envelope. I thanked Gary. I paid for my coffee. I walked to my car and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes, and then I drove home. This was the point of no return, not the phone call. The phone call was a suspicion. This was fact. This was documentation. This was the moment the decision I'd made in my kitchen at 5 in the morning stopped being a thought and became a plan with legal backing and time-stamped evidence. I called Patricia from my car. "I have the documentation," I said. "Good," she said. "Then we begin." That evening, Daniel came home from work and asked what I wanted for dinner. I said I was thinking about making pasta. He said that sounded great. He set the table. We ate together. He didn't know. He couldn't tell. I had become, entirely without intending to, very good at this, and I wasn't sure whether to be frightened by that or grateful. Patricia moved quickly once I gave her the green light. Within the week, she had filed the initial divorce petition, citing irreconcilable differences, which she advised was the cleanest path legally, regardless of what we both knew, and prepared a formal request for full financial disclosure. She also filed a motion to freeze our joint assets temporarily, a protective measure to prevent any sudden transfers. This was the part that would make noise. This was the part that would hit Daniel somewhere he felt it. He was served on a Tuesday afternoon at his office. I know this because Gary had suggested, and Patricia had agreed, that serving him at work was legal, within his rights, and practically speaking, it meant Daniel would be surrounded by colleagues when he received the papers. He would have to compose himself. He would not be able to come home and immediately explode. He would have time to stew, and I would have time to be ready. I was home when he arrived that evening. I was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, and I had already moved certain things I cared about: photographs, documents, a jewelry box from my grandmother, to my sister Amy's house across town. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would be missed quickly. Just the things that were mine and that I didn't want damaged in the inevitable storm. The storm came fast. Daniel walked in holding the papers. His face was a color I'd never seen on him before. Pale and flushed at the same time, rage and panic fighting for space. "What is this?" he said. "Papers," I said. "You should read them." "Laura, what the hell? Are you serious? You hired a lawyer without even talking to me." "The way you had a relationship with Rachel without talking to me?" Silence. Absolute confirming silence. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. I saw the calculation cross his face, and he understood that I was not asking a question. I was informing him that I knew and that I had documentation, and that we were past the stage where denial would help him. He sat down heavily. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." The conversation that followed was not what movies prepare you for. There was no weeping apology, no dramatic confession. What there was, and this told me everything I needed to know about who Daniel actually was negotiation. He wanted to know what it would take. He wanted to know if we could handle this quietly. He was already thinking about his reputation at work, about who in our social circle would find out, about the optics. Rachel called me the next morning. I almost didn't answer, and then I decided I wanted to hear what she would say. She said, "Laura, I need you to know. This is not what it looks like. I know that sounds..." "Rachel." I kept my voice very calm. "I have photographs. I have a lawyer. I have a timeline of 14 months. So please don't." She shifted tone almost instantly. The apologetic warmth evaporated, replaced by something harder. "You need to understand that Daniel wasn't happy, and you need to think very carefully about how you want to do this, because if you push, it gets ugly for everyone." There it was, a threat dressed in concern's clothing. "Thank you for the advice," I said and hung up. Within 2 days, I began receiving pressure from Daniel's side. His brother called, a man I'd never particularly liked, suggesting I was acting out of emotion and should consider mediation before I threw away my marriage. Daniel himself left a long voicemail about how we could fix this, that it was a mistake, that Rachel had meant nothing. And then, on Saturday, Rachel showed up at my door. She stood on my porch and told me, calmly, with a kind of confidence that made my stomach turn, that she had screenshots of text messages between me and Daniel where I'd complained about our marriage, that she would share them with anyone who needed to see them to show that I'd been emotionally unavailable for years, that was prepared to argue in any proceeding that the marriage had already failed before she was involved. I looked at her for a long moment on my doorstep. "Rachel," I said, "talk to my lawyer." I closed the door. I stood with my back against it for a moment, heart beating harder than I wanted to admit. Then I texted Patricia. "Rachel just threatened to use personal text messages in proceedings. Can we address this?" Patricia's reply came in 4 minutes. "Already on it. She has no standing. Get some rest this weekend." And so I did. I drove to Amy's house on Sunday, and I spent 2 days eating her cooking, playing with her kids, watching terrible reality television, and letting myself be held together by someone who loved me without condition. I needed it. The armor I'd built was real, but it was heavy, and I needed to set it down somewhere safe for a moment before I could put it back on. The following week brought a different kind of pressure, softer, more calculated, and in some ways more insidious than the confrontation on my doorstep. Daniel sent flowers, not an arrangement from a grocery store. Actual flowers from the florist downtown where he'd bought them for our anniversaries. White roses and lavender, my favorites, with a card that read, "I know I destroyed your trust, but I believe we can rebuild. Please give me the chance. D." I set them in the kitchen because they were genuinely beautiful, and I was not going to throw beauty away on principle. But I felt nothing reading that card, nothing warm. That surprised me, once, but not anymore. What Daniel had systematically dismantled over 14 months of lies was not just my trust. It was the architecture of feeling through which I'd loved him. When you realize that the person you were loving was partly a performance, the love doesn't vanish exactly. It just loses its address. It has nowhere to go. He called that evening. I answered because Patricia had advised me to keep communication open and documented while proceedings were active. "Did you get the flowers?" he asked. "They're lovely." "I meant what the card said, Laura." His voice was careful, practiced. Not the voice of genuine remorse I'd come to understand, but the voice of a man trying to locate the correct key for a specific lock. "I think we gave up on something real. I think if you just give us a chance to talk, not through lawyers, just us, we could find our way back." I waited a moment before answering, and then I said, "Daniel, right now everything goes through Patricia. You know that. You're hiding behind lawyers. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." He was quiet, then, "You're being cruel." And there it was. The reframe. The audacity of it was almost impressive. He had maintained a secret relationship with my closest friend for over a year, and I was the one being cruel. "Good night, Daniel," I said, and ended the call. Rachel tried a different approach. She didn't call. She knew I'd stopped taking her calls directly. She had a mutual friend, a woman named Diane, whom we both knew from a book club, reach out to suggest lunch. I knew immediately what this was, a proxy approach, an attempt to open a back channel. I texted Diane warmly, thanked her for reaching out, and said I wasn't in a place for social engagements right now, but I'd love to reconnect in a few months. Clean, undramatic, closed. What I was doing, quietly, was building something real. My therapist, Dr. Sandra Okafor, a calm and precise woman I'd been seeing weekly since the start of all this, had said something that stayed with me. Isolation is what betrayal wants to create. Your job right now is to refuse that. So I did. I called my sister Amy, who already knew everything, and leaned into that relationship without apology. I reached out to 2 friends from my college years, women I'd drifted from during the years of building a marriage and a household, women I now realized I'd partly sacrificed on the altar of couplehood. Both responded with immediate warmth. Meredith, who lived in Milwaukee, drove down one weekend simply to sit with me. Jess, who worked in HR and had navigated her own brutal divorce 3 years prior, became a daily text message presence. Not overwhelming, just steady. "You doing okay today?" Every morning. I also joined a women's support group that Dr. Okafor had suggested. I went expecting to feel pitied and instead found myself in a room full of people who had survived things as bad and worse, who were funny and sharp and honest about the ugliness of what they'd been through. I went twice a month. It grounded me. Daniel and Rachel, I knew through Patricia, were watching. Daniel's lawyer had communicated to Patricia that Daniel was confused by my composure. He'd apparently expected tears, instability, erratic behavior that might disadvantage my position. My calmness was unsettling him. "Good," Patricia had said. "Let it." Rachel, according to Diane, who had come to understand she'd been used as a pawn and was now quietly on my side, was frustrated that I hadn't responded emotionally to any of their approaches. She'd expected a dramatic confrontation. She'd expected anger she could characterize as instability. What she was getting was a woman who declined every bait with perfect, maddening grace. I wasn't performing calm. I was actually finding it. Not because I wasn't hurting. I was, in waves, in the dark hours of the night when the house was quiet and the reality of what had been taken from me pressed down like weight. But I had learned, in those weeks, to let the grief move through me without letting it steer me, to feel it and remain standing. And standing, it turned out, was exactly the right position for what was coming. It was a Sunday afternoon in May, and I was in the kitchen making soup, a big batch, the kind that takes most of the afternoon, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, walked to the front door, and opened it. Daniel and Rachel were standing on my porch, together. The audacity of it hit me like a physical thing. They'd come jointly, which meant this had been coordinated. This was not a spontaneous gesture. This was choreographed. Daniel was wearing the blue sweater I'd given him 2 birthdays ago. Whether that was deliberate, a softness tactic, I couldn't know, but I noted it. Rachel was dressed simply, no makeup, which was unlike her. She wanted to appear without armor, non-threatening, humble. I noted that too. "Laura," Daniel said, "can we come in? 5 minutes, please." I looked at them both for a moment. Then I stepped back and held the door open because I wanted to hear what they'd prepared and because whatever they said, Patricia needed to know. They sat at my kitchen table. The same table from Gary's photograph, I thought, though this was my table, my kitchen. And Daniel spoke first. "We owe you an apology, both of us." He glanced at Rachel, who nodded with studied sincerity. "What happened was wrong. There's no excuse for how we handled it. But Laura, I need you to think about what a divorce means for both of us. The house, the accounts, the years we built together. We can still settle this between ourselves. Without courts, without lawyers draining everything we've made. We're asking you to consider mediation, to talk to us like adults instead of going to war." Rachel leaned forward slightly. "I know I'm the last person who has the right to ask you for anything, but what happened between Daniel and me? It came from something that was already broken. That's not blame. That's just honesty. We both know your marriage wasn't perfect, and I think you know deep down that going through with all this—" She gestured vaguely, the way people gesture at things they'd rather minimize, "is going to hurt you too." There it was, dressed in softness and remorse, but there it was. It was already broken, meaning this is partly your fault. Going through with all this will hurt you too, meaning stand down or we will make sure of it. I let the silence sit for a moment after Rachel finished. Then I folded my hands on the table and said, very quietly, "I'm going to say this once, so please listen carefully. I don't need your mediation. I don't need your apology used as a negotiating tool. I understand exactly what's being offered here, and the answer is no. Patricia Holt is my attorney. Everything. Every conversation, every proposal, every request goes through her. If you'd like to contact her, here's her card." I slid a business card across the table. I'd had it ready in my pocket. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd expected this visit. Maybe not both of them, but something like it. Daniel's expression shifted. The practiced remorse drained out of it, and something sharper came through. Not quite rage, but its predecessor. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Then let the lawyers make it easy," I said. Rachel stood up first. Her composure was almost completely gone now, and under it I saw something I recognized: desperation. She and Daniel had bet on breaking me down in this room, and it hadn't worked, and she didn't know what to do with that. "Laura, you're being irrational. Please leave my house." She stopped. "Now," I said. They left. I stood in the kitchen after the door closed and listened to the silence of my house, and I noticed that my hands were trembling slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the sustained effort of holding myself so completely still, while every instinct screamed to crack, to yell, to say all the things I'd never be able to unsay. But I hadn't, and that mattered. Dr. Okafor had once said that self-control in a crisis is not repression. It's a form of power. Choosing what you release and what you keep. I thought about that as I went back to my soup. I turned the heat down and stirred it. And I thought, they came here to find a wound they could widen. And I didn't give them one. That evening, I called Patricia and told her about the visit. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "They're worried. The visit tells me they've looked at the asset disclosure and realized the numbers aren't in their favor. They wanted to settle on their terms before we go further." "What does further look like?" I asked. "Better for you," she said. I went to bed that night with something that wasn't quite peace, but was pointed in its direction. A fear that, somewhere in its cold center, had calcified into something harder. Something that could hold its own weight. The mediation session was Patricia's idea, not mine. She'd proposed it strategically. Not because she thought Daniel would be fair, but because she wanted him across a table with a neutral third party present, on record, when the financial disclosure documents landed in front of him. Because Patricia had found something. It had taken her paralegal 3 weeks of careful document review, but they'd located it. A brokerage account, held solely in Daniel's name, opened 18 months ago. The account held just over $68,000, a sum that had been moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic flagging from our joint savings over the previous year and a half. It was, Patricia said, a textbook case of asset dissipation, a spouse moving marital funds to a private account in anticipation of a divorce he'd been quietly planning. He had been planning to leave me. While sleeping in our bed and eating at our table and kissing my forehead on Friday mornings, he had been methodically preparing for an exit. The affair with Rachel wasn't just loneliness or weakness. It was part of a longer architecture, a life he'd been quietly building to walk into. I sat with that knowledge for a full day before the mediation. I let it be as ugly as it was. And then I walked into that conference room with Patricia and I sat down, and I felt not anger, but something I can only describe as absolute clarity. The room was on the 3rd floor of a neutral law office downtown. Beige carpet, a long table, water glasses. Daniel's attorney, a man named Kerrigan, was already seated. Daniel arrived 2 minutes later and sat across from me for the first time since I'd asked Rachel to leave my house. He looked tired. He'd lost weight. He didn't quite meet my eyes. Rachel was not present. She had no legal standing to be there. But I knew she'd been briefed on everything, the same way I knew she and Daniel had been speaking daily. The mediator, a retired judge named Ellis, opened proceedings and invited both parties to state their positions. Kerrigan spoke at length about reasonableness and collaborative spirit and the desire to avoid protracted litigation. Then Patricia placed the brokerage account documents on the table. The effect was immediate. Kerrigan stopped mid-sentence. Daniel's face went completely still. The particular stillness of a person trying to make an expression that doesn't give anything away and giving everything away in the attempt. "We've identified a private brokerage account," Patricia said, "opened 18 months ago, funded by incremental transfers from the marital savings account over 14 months. Total amount $68,400. We've flagged this to the court as potential dissipation of marital assets." Kerrigan looked at Daniel. The look was brief but surgical. The look of a lawyer realizing his client had not told him everything. "That account was," Daniel started. "We can discuss the account's purpose and origin in detail at the hearing," Patricia said pleasantly. "We thought it was appropriate to raise it here first." "Mr. Marsh," the mediator said carefully, "was this account disclosed in your financial affidavit?" Silence. A silence of about 5 seconds that told the entire story. There may have been an oversight. An oversight of $68,000, Patricia said. Still pleasant. Still even. Still absolutely merciless. Kerrigan asked for a recess. During the break, I sat with Patricia in a side room and she told me calmly that the undisclosed account had just changed our position dramatically. Non-disclosure of marital assets in a divorce proceeding is not just a civil matter. It can constitute fraud upon the court, and it shifts the equitable distribution calculus significantly in my favor. When we returned to the table, Daniel was a different color than he'd been before the break. He looked, for the first time since any of this had begun, genuinely frightened. Not of me, of consequences. He tried twice more to speak, once to minimize the account as investment funds he'd forgotten, once to suggest we table it and return to general terms. Both times, Patricia redirected him to Patricia with the precision of someone who had done this many, many times. And I sat there and said almost nothing. I answered the mediator's direct questions to me. I signed the documents Patricia indicated. I drank a glass of water. I watched Daniel unravel in real time, and I felt no satisfaction, only a steady, sober recognition. This was always what was under the surface. Charm and careful management and a private account he'd been filling in secret. This was who I had shared 7 years with. When we left the building, Patricia touched my arm briefly. "He'll settle," she said, "and it will be on our terms." Outside, the May air was cool and clean. I tilted my head back for just a moment and breathed it in. Daniel settled 11 days after the mediation session. He didn't have much choice. The undisclosed brokerage account had fundamentally altered the legal landscape of our divorce. Patricia had filed a motion with the court documenting the asset, characterizing it as both a dissipation of marital funds and a potential fraud on the court in the disclosure process. Daniel's attorney had spent those 11 days quietly advising his client that fighting this in front of a judge, with a private investigator's photographs, a 14-month timeline, and $68,000 in hidden funds, was a battle he would not win cleanly. The terms of the settlement, which Patricia had negotiated with the precision of someone who enjoyed winning without raising her voice, were as follows. I received the house. Daniel had argued for a sale and split of the equity. Patricia had argued, successfully, for a buyout based on the fact that I had been the primary maintainer of the property and that Daniel's conduct, including the asset dissipation, had disrupted the good faith basis for equal division. He paid me my share of the equity, plus a substantial additional sum as resolution of the hidden account dispute. All told, the financial outcome gave me the house, outright, plus a settlement payment that, combined with the equity, represented far more than a clean 50-50 split would have yielded. I also received a fair share of his 401k. Not all of it, which Patricia had been clear was unrealistic, but a proportion that reflected the years of my career flexibility that had supported his ability to accumulate it. I waived alimony. That was my choice, not Patricia's recommendation. She'd told me I had a case for it given the circumstances and the income differential during our marriage, but I didn't want it. I wanted to sever the financial cord as completely as possible. No monthly payment, no ongoing entanglement, nothing that kept Daniel's name on any document I had to look at regularly. Patricia noted my preference and drafted accordingly. Daniel signed everything on a Thursday. His signature looked smaller than I remembered his handwriting being, though perhaps I was imagining that. The moment the papers were filed and the judge accepted the settlement, I drove directly to Patricia's office, shook her hand, and wrote her a final check. She had earned every dollar of her fee 3 times over. She wished me well with the kind of direct, undramatic sincerity that I had come to understand was simply how she expressed things. And I walked out of her building into the afternoon and sat in my car for a long time, not crying, not celebrating, just sitting. Then there was the matter of Rachel. There were no legal proceedings against Rachel specifically. She had not been a party to my marriage in the eyes of the law, and Illinois is not a state where alienation of affection lawsuits are viable. Patricia had been clear on this point from the beginning. What I had were the social facts. People found out. I hadn't made a campaign of it. I hadn't called anyone to tell the story. But truth has a way of distributing itself, particularly when 2 people who are newly together were the married husband and the best friend of the woman they'd wronged. Mutual friends ask questions. Diane, who had quietly transferred her loyalty, was honest when people asked her directly. The book club folded. The group had been too defined by Rachel's organizational energy, and too many people had drawn their own conclusions about why it dissolved. Rachel had been employed at a mid-sized marketing firm where several of her colleagues also knew Daniel, and word reaches places. I heard through Diane that things were uncomfortable for her professionally, not a catastrophic fallout, but the kind of persistent social friction that follows you into every room. And Daniel. Daniel had walked away from the marriage with less than half of what he'd have received in an uncontested divorce. A formal court record that included documentation of hidden financial accounts and a professional reputation that had been touched by the proceedings in ways that professional reputations tend to be in a city where people talk. He'd also walked into a new relationship built on deception, under the pressure of everything that had just happened, with a woman who had also just lost her primary social network. In the weeks that followed, I heard they were together, officially, living in an apartment on the north side. I felt nothing about this except a faint, distant recognition that they deserved whatever they were building, whatever it turned out to be. I changed the locks on my house. I painted the front door a deep navy blue, a color Daniel had never liked, a color I'd always loved. I let Amy take me furniture shopping for the living room and spent money I'd been careful with for years on a sofa I chose entirely for myself. And I began, quietly and steadily, to recognize what my life might look like now that it was entirely my own. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I took a weekend trip to Traverse City with Amy and Meredith and Jess. The first trip I had taken purely for pleasure, with people I genuinely loved since I could clearly remember. We rented a small house near the lake. We hiked in the mornings and cooked dinner together at night and sat on the porch until late, talking about everything and nothing, and I remember looking at those women, really looking at them, and feeling something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not for the situation that had driven me here, but for the clarity it had created. I knew now exactly who I could count on. That was not a small thing. I had renegotiated my life's priorities with a ruthlessness that betrayal, paradoxically, sometimes teaches you. I returned to full-time work. Patricia's fees, the settlement logistics, and the frankly therapeutic exercise of financial self-sufficiency had clarified for me that I needed more professional structure. Not because I couldn't manage on what I had, but because work, it turned out, gave me something I hadn't fully appreciated when my life had been organized around someone else's schedule. Identity, momentum, a room of my own, professionally speaking. I accepted a full-time position at a healthcare billing company. Better pay, good benefits, and colleagues I found I actually liked. Within 4 months, I'd been recognized for a system efficiency recommendation I'd made and given a small but real promotion. The manager said I had a sharp eye for structure. I thought, "You have no idea." Biscuit, the dog, remained mine. Daniel had not contested this, which was the first sensible thing he'd done in the entire proceedings. I bought him a new bed and let him sleep on the sofa, which I'd never allowed before, and he seemed, if anything, calmer for it. We walked every morning, long loops through the neighborhood, and those walks became the thing I looked forward to most. The stillness of early morning, the dog trotting beside me, the sense of a day that belonged to me from its first moment. I kept seeing Dr. Okafor, not weekly anymore. We'd moved to bi-weekly and the conversations had shifted. Less crisis management, more construction. Who did I want to be now? What did I want? These were not small questions, and I let them take up space. About 8 months after the divorce, I met someone. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it was not the triumphant, romantic conclusion that stories sometimes rush toward. It was gentler than that. His name was Marcus, a quiet, thoughtful man who worked as a landscape architect and had his own history with loss. We met at a farmer's market. We had coffee that lasted 3 hours. We took things slowly with the kind of deliberate patience you only develop once you've learned the cost of moving too fast and trusting too easily. But something was growing there, tentative and real, and I let it grow without forcing it into a shape it wasn't ready for. And Rachel and Daniel. I learned these things through Diane, who remained my friend with a fidelity I found quietly moving, and through the ordinary fact-finding of life in a city where people intersect. The relationship between Daniel and Rachel had not survived its own foundation. This surprised no one, I think, least of all them. What they'd built together had been constructed in secret and pressure, and the particular intensity that deception creates. And without those conditions, without the illicit heat of it, what they had turned out to be was two people who had significant compatibility problems that the affair's excitement had obscured. Diane told me, without apparent pleasure, that they'd ended things around 7 months after Daniel's lease started. There had been, she said, an argument about money. Several, actually. Daniel's professional life had been complicated. The financial disclosure issue from the divorce proceedings had created a paper record that had, in ways I was not entirely privy to, affected a promotion he'd been expecting at his firm. He'd eventually left and taken a position at a smaller company at a lower salary. I heard this was something that was not satisfaction exactly, more like a sober recognition of cause and effect. Rachel had left Chicago entirely, not dramatically. She hadn't fled. She'd taken a job in Denver and moved, and I thought that probably was the right decision for her, to start over somewhere that didn't carry the weight of what she'd done in every social room she walked into. Whether she had made peace with it, I couldn't know. That was not my territory. My territory was this: the house with the navy blue door, the dog on the sofa, the job where my ideas mattered, the friends who showed up, the quiet Saturday mornings with coffee and a crossword puzzle. Still, always, the crossword. Except now, the only person I was answering to was myself. Was I entirely healed? No. There were still mornings when I woke up and the weight of it returned. Not grief for Daniel specifically, but grief for the version of the future I'd expected to be living. You don't lose 7 years without losing the shape of what you thought came next. That takes time. Dr. Okafor had said early in our work, healing is not the absence of pain, it's the presence of new things. I'd written that down. I came back to it often. The new things were real. They were mine, and they were enough, more than enough, to keep building on. If this story taught me anything, it's this: your composure is your power. Don't react, respond. Document everything. Trust the people who show up, not the ones who explain why they didn't. And when someone shows you who they are, through a phone call, a photograph, a silence, believe them the first time. The betrayal broke a life I thought was mine. What I found underneath was something more real, more solid, and entirely my own. What would you have done in my place? I'd love to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Every story deserves to be heard. And if this resonated with you, subscribe. There's more to come. Thank you for listening.